Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much for the Public Health Association for the invitation to present about the work that I've been doing here at Voices for Racial Justice. So I'm going to share my screen and make sure you can see my presentation. Can you all see it?
We sure can.
Awesome. So the work that I've been doing in Voices for Racial Justice for the last 3 years is about a framework, and we are calling it Centric Community in Policymaking, a framework to advance racial justice. You will see that this framework has a lot of questions that are meant to guide people in the policymaking process. When we were creating this framework, many of the organizers that contributed to this work talk about, should we make a framework only for policymakers like legislators, or only for advocates that work at the policy level at the state legislature or city council, or should we make a framework for community members? And all of them decided that we should just make a framework that invites everyone in the policymaking field to engage. So I will be talking about this framework in a little bit, and hopefully at the end we can engage with it. So before I start talking about the framework, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about the organization that I work with. So Voices for Racial Justice, it's a racial justice movement organization. We were created 32 years ago by multiple community organizers from different races, ethnicities, that saw the need for community organizers to come together and be trained about community organizing. What we do now is that we train BIPOC and Indigenous leaders to build the capacity for these leaders to be the change that they want and advance racial justice. The approach that we take is we do trainings, we also convene leaders, and also we shift narratives, make sure that the stories are told by us and no one else can tell us who we are and the resilience that we want to achieve, that we're doing, and the state that we want to build in the future. So the agenda of the presentation, we're going to be talking about racial disparities and how that led us to why we needed a tool or like a framework like this. Then we're going to engage with the framework itself. And at the end, we're going to have an activity where I want all of you to engage with a couple questions. So let's talk about Minnesota and the racial reality that we are experiencing and we have experiencing for a long time. So as we all know, Minnesota is a paradoxical place where it's a state that it's great to live for white communities, but it's one of the worst places to live for communities of color and Native communities across the nation. And how we know that is through data. And this is something that communities of color have experienced for a long time. And in the recent, 10 years, there's been efforts to build and measure those racial disparities in data. And we always want to point out people to two great sets of data that we want people to go when people wants to know what are the racial disparities. Sometimes people forget about them, and we wanted to share always one great source, which is that in 2020, after the George Floyd murder, and there was the awakening of having very candid conversations about racial disparities in Minnesota. The state house, um, the Minnesota State House, led by Melissa Horman, created a House Select Committee on Racial Justice, and they published a report. And can you see a report now? Yes, I think so. So they published a report about racial disparities in Minnesota in 2020. Something important to know about this report, I encourage everyone to please look at it, read it, because it really summarizes racial disparities, a bunch of them, but also it acknowledges three very important things. One, let me go to a conclusion because that's the section that it's very important for our work, and is these three things. So in this report, okay, wait, bear with me. Oh, here. So there are three things that this report finds, and is that as documented in this report, history of data led the select committee to conclude the following: systemic racism exists, systemic racism is harmful, and systemic racism must be addressed. Something else about this report is that this report was created by state officials and legislatures, people at the legislature. And if you here see names of representatives that are right now at the legislature, please bring this report back to them. I think a couple people that we have here in the news a lot is Representative Lisa Dimuth. As we know, she's running for governor, and also she's the Speaker of the House. The same as the Kaoli here. She's a mayor of St. Paul right now, and many other representatives. Some of them are no longer at the legislature, but it doesn't mean that we should. I mean, they were part of this report, and they're acknowledged, and the fact that their name is here, they're acknowledged that the veracity of the report. And going back to the presentation, another great source to learn about our racial disparities, and something more recent, because what we have seen currently is that people are saying that those numbers from and the report of the House Select Committee Racial Justice was before 2020, and that data is now a little bit old. So in the spirit to bring more outdated information about racial disparities, this is another great source that the State Demographer's Office published this year, and they use data from 2019 to 2023. And the report is a charter book with data from Minnesota's largest cultural groups, and it's a great source for people to understand the realities of our communities of color here in Minnesota. Something very important that I want to mention is this section, so I'm just going to read very quickly. In Minnesota, as is true across the nation, race is associated with the likelihood of living in poverty. The federal poverty threshold is our long-standing definition of extreme economic hardship. 27% of Black children and 32% of American Indian children in Minnesota are experiencing poverty. For non-Hispanic white children, is fewer than 1 in 10 living in extreme economic hardship. The differential access to opportunity and structural racism back through generations and up to the present have contributed to this and other widely disparate economic outcomes by race. Again, I will love for all you to take a moment to look at this report and see some of the racial disparities. One that is very outstanding for me, and I really, it got me curious, was a table where they summarize the ownership of our communities segregated by race. And okay, one second, which is at the end, but this is a table that summarizes households by owners, renter status, and cultural groups. And it was interesting to understand the racial disparities of ownership between white communities and other groups. Of course, there's more population of white communities in Minnesota, but in addition to that, it was a very important number for me to be curious about. I'm sure, Rodolfo, you're the expert on data and you can tell us more about it. But I just wanted to share another important set of data that tell us the current in terms of 2019 to 2023 racial disparities in Minnesota. I don't want to stay in the negative tone of racial disparities. I would say that because of our reality, also there's been important steps and there's been an amazing work that a lot of members, leaders, organizations, and people like you present have take a step towards addressing these racial disparities. I think one of them is declaring racism as a public health crisis in 2020. Um, and that's very important and it's an emblematic step towards addressing racism. And I just want to also take the moment to celebrate the resistance, because many of us and many people here and many other people have taken racial disparities very seriously, are taking important steps, including the Department of Health. Of course, it's not perfect, but we have seen that within the department, there have been important steps considering and addressing the racial disparities in our state. So yes, we face a very difficult racial disparities reality, but at the same time, there's people that are working to address those. So that was kind of like a very big introduction to the tool. But I just wanted to connect it to the fact that we know that a structural racism exists and it's a structural problem. Therefore, we need a structural solutions. So when we were trying to design this framework, we wanted to address the racism that exists at a macro level. So we wanted to address at an institutional level and on a structural level. Of course, we understand that the individual piece is very important, but we wanted to create a tool that could help us to address the racism at a macro level. When we decided a tool, we said that we wanted to address structural racism in policy making spaces, because what we have seen is that the racial disparities are a product of numerous policies that's been taking place. So we said how we can create a framework that could help us to understand how we need to change how policies get made, because as of right now, that had allowed for policies to create racial disparities in Minnesota. So now I'm gonna give you a timeline of how this framework came to be. So in 2009, Voices for Social Justice, in collaboration with other organizers, published the Racial Equity Impact Assessment Pocket Guide. And this was a very beautiful effort that the intention was to have legislators have this assessment folded in a pocket side and put it in their pocket. And the intention was that when legislators were going to talk about policies, they could ask these 5 key questions. The first one be, who is the most impacted? What disparities is being addressed? How will the proposed policy change the situation? And are there potential negative impacts for BIPOC communities and indigenous communities? And can the policy be sustainably successful? So back then, it was in 2009, a bunch of organizers came together and decided that these are like very basic 5 questions that we wanted legislators to ask before voting on policies. This was published in 2015. And for many years, we noticed how legislators were not using it. We saw some legislators trying to incorporate this in their own work. However, racial disparities continue to exist. And after George Floyd, and of course, after the pandemic, we noticed that we needed to do something else. So what we decided to do is hold and host a series of kitchen table conversations. So in 2023, 2024, we have conversation with community leaders and advocates that could help us to improve this tool, because we consider that this initial pocket guide had very important knowledge, but we wanted to transform in something more useful for people. And we also noticed that we were focused too much on legislators, how we can focus more in community advocates and, yes, policy leaders as well. So the two key questions that we struggled with was, how does racial justice in policymaking require, and how to make a tool that transform policymaking process. Again, acknowledging that the policymaking system as it exists right now, it has allowed for racial disparities to exist. So we wanted something that could challenge that. So moving to 2025, after those conversations, we published the framework, which we call a Centering Community in Policy Making, a framework to advance racial justice. And we will get in a minute to see itself, the framework. And we publish a workbook. I'm sure after the presentation, we will send links for you to all access the workbook and the tool itself. So this is a picture of the community advocates and leaders who help us to create the framework. And it's thanks for them that we were able to create this framework. So thank you for everyone who contributed to this. So the basic vision of this framework is to radically reimagine policymaking spaces by centering community in policymaking. And right out of the bat, two really important words from this sentence is community, and the other one is policymaking. So we understand that community, when you're working on your own projects and work and in policymaking, when we ask who is your community, we understand that community can be defined in different ways, and community is not a monolithic, and it changes over time and is very complex, because the racial disparities that one set of group of people are experiencing might be very different from other set group of people, and those two sets of group of people are your community. But within that, we want to invite people to consider that when you're doing your research or your work, always try to think that when you define community, think about the Black, Indigenous, and people of color that are most impacted by structural harms of white supremacy and exploitation based on race, ethnicity. For example, now that we are in the aftermath of Operation Metro Surge, there's a lot of research doing about the impact of this operation in our communities. Then again, it's an invitation that when we do a research about the communities, then think about how that Operation Metro Surge impacted Black communities, impacted Indigenous communities, that it might be different, impacted Latino communities, and so on and so on. And within those ethnic and racial groups, of course, take into consideration deeper identities such as gender, class, and more. The other very important work is policymaking. We believe that policymaking is every space where decisions that affect a collective gets made. Yes, the most known are the state legislature, city halls, school boards, government agencies, private corporations, but also policymaking spaces are everywhere, in your own organization, in the place that you work, in nonprofits, even in family. Family also has rules and policies. Might be informal, but also is a place where there's policy gets made. So what we want is that this tool is used in every space where decisions that affect the collective gets made. Because what we have known is that policy, especially policies, have been a way to legalize oppression to serve the interests of those who profit from white supremacies. So as an example, who was the people who were allowed to vote since the creation of the United States? So I'm sure you know, so if you want to say who, you can say it now. If you feel shy, you can type that in the chat. But the people who were allowed to vote when the United States was created as a democracy were white male landowners, and in some states that belong to some religion. But also, in addition, if we think about it more currently, um, recently the federal government passed a bill that give very generous tax incentives or tax benefits to the wealthiest communities in our nation, um, at expenses of cutting benefits to SNAP and Medicare. So that shows us that it's not something of the past. That shows us also something that is very present. Um, and in addition to that, policy-making spaces have been intentionally excluded the most impacted communities for generations, have seen how policies are created from a from an agenda, from a political party, rather from community base. This is not the norm, but I've seen how that has happened. So we wanted that the policies be rooted in community rather from coming from a book or coming from a political party to benefit just a few. So what is this tool for? This framework is for organizers and advocates to deeper community relationships, build their agendas, elected officials so they could create thoughtful policy with BIPOC communities, for research and evaluators to ensure the implementation has a real impact, for community members feel powerful, influence policy and own justice work, but literally is for everyone who cares about equity and centering community in policy. And and this is a tool that it welcomes everyone who is in different stages of the policy making work. You don't have to be a policy savvy to be able to use this framework. It's for everyone in whatever stage you are in the policy making process. So before we engage with the framework, this is is a user guide. So we need to understand that the work of racial justice and racial equity did not begin and will never end with us. So we don't pretend that this framework is going to bring us to racial justice, but it helps us to one, understand that this is the product of many people before us that have contributed and have done so much for us to be here and continue and use their legacy to continue building upon that work and continue addressing racial disparities in Minnesota. And it's up to the next generations to continue working on that. Then this work, the policy making space is not linear, it's no it has different paths, and don't pretend that when we engage with this framework, use this framework as a checklist to answer questions and then move on. Some of the questions that this framework has, perhaps we don't have the answer, and that's okay. That's information itself, and also accept a lack of closure. Yeah, sometimes we're not going to have the answers, and sometimes we understand that this framework is not perfect. And also, all the questions in this framework are written in a we form to acknowledge the collective power that drives our liberation, and that the most impacted community at the center of the conversation should be always in the conversation. So this is the framework. So as you will see, the framework is divided in five. Oh my God, wait. In 5 different sections. The most important one, and the one that is at the center of the framework, it's about community leadership. And we want that everyone who is in policymaking space asks this question: how are the most impacted communities identifying and leading the policy solution? We understand that this is a very important and might be a very big question, but we also created some sub questions that help to guide to answer the main question. So some of the sub questions for the community leadership area is, who needs to be at the center of this conversation? So when you're formulating your policy, who really needs to be here? How is community be identified in this particular effort? What are the dreams and vision of this community? How do they want their lives to be transformed of themselves and future generations? What is the specific issue or policy idea that the impacted community has proposed or support? And what are the ways the most impacted community wants to share their experience, and how do we make the input and leadership possible? We understand that this area is about authentic community engagement. And when we engage with the most impacted, we also need to create spaces where people feel welcome and valued, and make sure that those experiences are taken into consideration. The other four areas are the root causes. We always need to have a root causes analysis. What is the racial justice issue we really want to solve? How are we identifying the root causes of the current injustice? What data are we using to define this injustice? How do we have an intersectional analysis that recognizes the different ways injustice impacts different members with the most impacted communities? Who benefits from this injustice and will likely oppose to this policy or any changes to the system? What does our policy solution need to remove or build to help us solve this injustice and achieve the community long-term vision? The next area is about collaboration, because we know that policymaking is a process that is very collaborative. So how do we work together to achieve the policy solution? Since the beginning, we need to make sure that make sure that we know how have each of us reflected on the life experiences, biases, and traumas we are bringing to the table. How can we avoid causing harm or replicating oppression towards ourselves or others? What are our shared values and agreements as we work in relationship with each other towards this policy change? What are the roles, responsibilities, and accountability for organizers, policymakers, community members in this process? What is our decision-making process? How can we each contribute our specific skills, knowledge, and capacity to achieve the policy solution? The next one is about conflict. And something that we have noticed is that there's always going to be tension and conflict in policymaking. So how do we navigate the tensions and the trade-offs to decide the policy details? What I mean policy details is, for example, the details that goes into a policy bill. So what is our process or agreements around navigating conflict and tension as we work towards this particular policy? What are the non-negotiables or bottom lines for our policy? The things that will not sacrifice or compromises we won't make because they will violate our shared values and agreements. How we will work together to negotiate the unavoidable trade-offs of any policy for different communities and different people within our own communities. How do we assess whether this policy conflicts with other policies or might have unintended consequences in our communities? And the last one is about confirmation and just sustainability of the policy. How do we make sure that the policy achieves the change we want? What type of resources, funding, staff capacity, community organizations do we need for the policy to be successful? How do we ensure the policy is implemented in a positive way and leaders are held accountable to make the policy work the way we envision it? How are the most impacted communities providing feedback on the effects of the policy in their daily lives? How is this being integrated into evaluation and changes to the policy? How is this policy effort creating opportunities for the most impacted communities to build capacity and power to advance solutions in the future? Now, for us, the core of this framework is not to answer the questions. for us, the core of this framework is that if you struggle with the question, that is the work itself. The fact that you are asking these questions to yourself and making the exercise to try to answer, that's the effort itself. It's not bringing the answers, that comes after, but it's, if you struggle with the question, that is, for us, is enough. That's the work itself. So again, this framework is created for everyone who is in the policymaking space in different stages, from people who already have a coalition, from people who already are trying to formulate a policy or trying to work with your own community to bring a policy change. So now I wanted to share with you how Voices for Racial Justice is using this framework. So right now, what we have been doing since 2025 to 2026 right now is that we've been using these frameworks, so these questions, and trying to struggle with the answer of these questions to guide policy effort. And the one that we have been working on is the community impact notes policy effort. And we've been using with a coalition, and that is called the Community Impact Notes Coalition. Basically, this is a policy idea that what we imagine is that when policies get introduced or debated and discussed at the state legislature, we want to impact notes. So it's similar to fiscal notes. So fiscal notes is a report that tells how much a bill or like a policy will cost to a state. But instead of focusing on the finance, the community impact notes will be a report that tells the potential impact that a policy will have to different communities based on race, ethnicity, geographic location, gender, and so on. So what we have been doing is that use this framework to guide our policy details, deepen our relationship with the coalition members, stay accountable and centered to those most impacted communities, and invest in their leadership. And in 2025, we had a 4-session training series with the Community Impact Notes Coalition members, where we dive into the framework itself. And we, as a coalition, struggle with these questions. So we make sure that each member of the Community Impact Notes Coalition were able to have time and space to answer these questions, keeping in mind our bill, our Community Impact Notes bill. Currently, what we are doing is we're designing a training for other people to engage with this framework, and that will be launched in 2026. So please stay tuned for some training about this framework if this is something that you are interested. So I think now it's time for us to engage with the tool. So what I want right now is everyone think about this question. Think of a policy you have worked on. It can be local, state, federal, or even internal at your organization. And reflect on this individually. Who were the most impacted communities in that policy effort? And what was your relationship with them? So I'm gonna stop presenting, and I would like to have people have some thoughts. I could place these questions in the chat, but I just wanted people to have time, maybe a couple minutes, to reflect about this.
That's great. Thanks. Sanava, can you stop the recording so we can have an open and free conversation?